Hey, we've not done off-meta builds on the channel for quite a while, so today we're going to look at a bunch of gimmicky skills and see what kind of wacky armor sets we can come up with. One of the great things about Monster Hunter is that you can get really creative when building armor sets, and this video is really only able to scratch the tip of that iceberg. So if you've got some other nutty sets, I'd love to see them in the comments. Before we start, mileage will vary with these sets, as I've built them with my augments in mind. Previously, I've made a video about how to adapt builds that you find online to the charms/armor augments that you have. So check that out to help you adapt any of these sets that you see here and that you want to try out. Either way, the main focus of the sets in this video isn't the armor pieces, but the ideas behind them, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Let's start off with a Spiral Thrust armor set. Spiral Thrust hasn't been seeing much love or usage in Sunbreak, although that's probably for the best, considering how dominant the move was back in the base game. But the whole point of this video is to make gimmick sets using skills that you wouldn't normally use. So let's take the unique quirks that Spiral Thrust has and make something wacky. The first thing that comes to mind is Hellfire Cloak. Hellfire Cloak has a really fun interaction with Spiral Thrust. In case you didn't know, some wirebug attacks, usually the ones that move you around a lot, will drop Hellfire Blight onto the floor, just as if you were using your wild wirebug while your weapon is sheathed. If the monster walks into your blob of fire enough times, then it will result in free knockdowns. The skill itself is actually quite good, and you'll often see it in speedruns. It will let you reliably use the skill Resuscitate, and it will also proc Coalescence when you drop the Blight onto the ground. However, I wouldn't normally recommend using Hellfire Cloak with Dereliction or Bloodlust outside of a scripted speedrun setting, as predicting when the Blight is about to go off can get really tricky. If it does go off while you're using Bloodlust or Dereliction, then at best you'll lose all your red health, preventing you from healing it back later, but at worst you'll be at low health and you'll just die to the Blight. Considering all of that, we'll make this set without Bloodlust in mind, but if you are interested in making a full-on Hellfire build, then go right ahead. Hellfire Cloak also works really well with Sheathing Retreat, so if you really want to, why not slap it onto your normal set and give it a try there as well. Going back to theory crafting armor, Hellfire Cloak is interesting as it sort of gives you two different ways to play with it. On one hand, go for the Spiral Thrust spam method of hunting and take skills like Wirebug Whisperer to maximize your Spiral Thrust spam. Or you could go for the opposite and really lean in on using Hellfire Cloak to activate Resuscitate and Coalescence by using your Spiral Thrusts sparingly. And if you're not using Bloodlust or mainly Dereliction, then you could even swap skills. While we're here, let's make something for the other ST, Skyward Thrust. I didn't talk about it in the previous segment about Spiral Thrust, but something that's worth mentioning when you're building around different things is that different attacks, or rather different playstyles, are going to have different rates of sharpness usage. You might hit faster, you might hit slower, you might have attacks that do many attacks but only use one unit of sharpness. Another thing to mention is that your element to raw ratio on the combos or the attacks that you're using is probably going to change as well. And because of that, the lances that you want to use might change. Looking at Skyward Thrust itself, it's an interesting example because it's a real sharpness guzzler. If you're hitting all the hits, then it's going to consume 4 units per attack or per wire bug, and that's really steep. And it's also going to change our estimated sharpness requirements. Usually we want around 120 units of sharpness per area with the lance, but when we use skyward thrust spam, we're probably going to want sharpness in the ballpark of this number here. Going back to the element to raw ratios within the combos, spamming skyward thrust is going to change that and make it more raw favorable, which in turn will affect which lances are going to be optimal for this playstyle. Honestly, this kind of thing is big enough to make its own video about, so maybe we'll cover it in more depth later on. But to quickly show you how the current meta lances would look like if we just plugged the skyward thrust damage ratio into the charts, then it would look a little bit like this. Going back to skyward thrust, another thing to consider for using skyward thrust spam is Wirebug Whisperer, because at level 3 it's going to increase the recharge rate of our wirebugs, and that's pretty good if you want to spam skyward thrust. I'll have background footage showing off the recharge rates when using Wirebug Whisperer and when not. It's not huge, so it's up to you to decide if it's worth using. Other than that, there isn't really much that we can do with skyward thrust, as you basically just want to build the normal meta set. I guess we could try shoehorn in the skill Intrepid Heart, which lets us hyper armor through a single attack once you've filled up the Intrepid Heart bar. Skyward thrust is a bit notorious for the amount of end lag it has, making it really risky to actually use if you don't want to get hit by the monster's next attack. Intrepid Heart sort of covers for that weakness, and it would let you skyward thrust more riskily once you've got your bar full. But we're scraping the bottom of the barrel here in terms of actual synergy between the move and the skill. Speaking of new skills from Title Update 2, it's time for something crazy involving Embolden. Embolden and Guard can stack together, and combining the two is going to make us very good at blocking hits and tanking through knockback. If we combine that with Leaping Thrust, we can create a really memey Leaping Thrust spam build. If someone ever needs one of those immortal, unkillable builds, this is probably the best version for Lance. It's still completely overkill, but hey, you can basically ignore what the monster is doing and just spam Leaping Thrust until it's dead. Other skills you'd want are obviously Guard Up 3 for those unblockable attacks, and then maybe some stamina skills so that you can spam Leaping Thrust more. I don't know, just spam Leaping Thrust. It's as simple as that. Talking of gimmicks, shall we speak about Sneak Attack? Sneak Attack is a really odd skill, especially for Lance, as for the most part, Lance is best used as a solo weapon, and without someone to take the monster's attention away from you, getting behind the monster to activate the skill is unsurprisingly quite difficult. And even when you do have other hunters with you, it's still quite hard to get round behind the monster. So using it as a damage skill isn't very realistic. And this is all before we even start thinking about monster hit zones and if it's actually worth going round the back of the monster. That said, Sneak Attack is a huge damage buff, so if you can figure out when it works, it's worth using in that situation. So firstly, we've got a run-of-the-mill kill the monster damage set. This is mainly a return to the bygone era of Monster Hunter etiquette, where hammer users had priority at the head, and us Blade Masters were tasked with hanging around behind the monster and, slowly chipping away at its tail. In theory, this could be a genuinely good armor set. The caveats being, you've got to be in multiplayer, and you've got to be able to actually stay behind the monster. Secondly, we've got a sneak attack set specifically for cutting tails. In a similar vein to sneak attack as a whole, it's going to be very niche. It's sad to say, but tail cutting runs are a bit of a relic of the past at this point, so I'm not really sure when you'd actually use this set. But if you do need to cut a tail, this will do the job very nicely. And you've got loads of space in your equipment box, so what's the harm of just one extra set? Is it time that we looked at Evade Lance? Let's look at some Evade Lance sets. Evade Lance is interesting in how different it can end up being compared to, for lack of a better term, Guard Lance. Because the game has a bunch of different skills that don't trigger on guard, but do activate, or at least work around, evasion. You could use Bubbly Dance to bump up those iframes, while also triggering other damage skills. Evasion also gives you access to Blade Scale Hone for an alternative method of sharpness protection. You've also got Adrenaline Rush, which is essentially a weaker version of Offensive Guard, but for Evade Lancing. And you've even got Status Trigger, which, 1, combos brilliantly with Build-Up Boost, but 2, also makes status weapons, mainly Sleep and Paralysis, sort of viable on melee weapons. Bubbly Dance is a skill that really deserves more love than it gets. It's a higher input, higher output version of Evade Window. I've been unable to find any concrete data on how many extra iframes Bubbly Dance gives, but it seems to equate to around Evade Window 2 or 3, so it's plenty good enough to use on its own, but you can also bolster it with other evade skills, like Embolden or plain old Evade Window. But the real winning strategy with Bubbly Dance is that it enables you to reliably activate Resuscitate, enabling your damage to scale further than if you were just using Evasion. Plus, you get all those silly bubbles around your character. What's not to love? I've already touched upon using Blade Scale Hone alongside Grinder S in a previous video, so we'll ignore rehashing the same ground, but one thing I didn't elaborate on very well was how useful Blade Scale Hone is as a general sharpness management skill. The real value is that you can use it at lower levels to make your sharpness management more efficient. The way Blade Scale Hone works is that it gives you 10 units of sharpness back whenever you activate the skill, and increasing the level of Blade Scale Hone increases the chance of it proccing per dodge. What this means is having only 1 point of Blade Scale Hone will still give you functionally infinite sharpness as long as you're dodging 2 attacks per 10 units of sharpness consumed. Ish. The caveat is that if you're doing more than that, you will slowly drain your sharpness, and there will be situations where you're not dodging monster attacks for a decent period of time, such as when the monster's being knocked over. So you will slowly lose sharpness over the hunt. But on the flip side, most lances come with more than 10 units of sharpness, so you've got the wiggle room that you need. Either way, Blade Scale Hone is a really strong form of sharpness protection for Evade Lance, and it's not something to sleep on. Going back to the evade side of Evade Lance, another option for evade lancing is the skill Redirection. The skill gives you iframes while you perform a skill swap, and the iframes are quite generous. Sitting around 28 frames, it's more than you'd get for maxing out Evade Window, but it's still less than Sheathing Retreat. However, the really interesting part of Redirection is that at level 2, when you successfully perform the Redirection skill swap dodge, it will recover a wire bug if you've currently got one recharging. So you can use it in combination with Spiral Thrust and Skyward Thrust to better recycle your wire bugs and maximize your ST spam. And I guess that makes it a skill worth considering for the Spiral Thrust and Skyward Thrust sets that we were talking about earlier. Redirection does come with some caveats. The way it launches you can be a bit finicky, and sometimes you'll be launched in a way that makes taking damage unavoidable. But as a whole, it's an interesting thing to try if you want a new way of playing with the weapon. Another thing that we could do is use Status Trigger as a core skill to make a sleep bombing set. Just like tail cutting runs, sleep bombing is a strategy that has fallen off in viability, largely due to power creep and the player's weapon damage just getting larger and larger and larger. So it's not going to be the most optimal way of playing the game. And if I'm honest, it's probably more optimal to just wail on the monster as it's falling asleep and wail on the monster as it wakes back up, rather than waiting and placing bombs. But also remember that it's not always the case if you've got like a greatsword. So if you're playing in lobbies online and other people stop attacking, you should stop attacking. Don't be an asshole. Because sleep bombing can be fun for people. And sleep bombing being fun is exactly why this set is here. Especially as you can use the bomb that you used to wake the monster up with to also give yourself a yellow anchorage buff for some extra juicy damage modifiers. So we're now stretching into the really dumb but kind of funny to do it sort of territory of armor sets. These aren't going to be good, they're going to be very gimmicky, but you might get a kick out of them. So one of the much overlooked skills is Furious. No, the skill isn't Mad, the skill is called Furious. And it's on the Furious Armor Rajang. Confusing, I know. The main gimmick with the skill is that once you've built up a Fury bar, you can skill swap to blue mode and you'll have an unlimited amount of stamina for a period of time. One of the age-old noob strategies back in the day was to drink a mega dash juice and just take the dash attack, the lance charge, and just constantly drive that lance straight into the monster. And that's what this set is going to be doing. We're going to throw on some other skills like Intrepid Heart to maximize our lasting power while we're in that little charge. But the main aim of this armor set is activate Fury mode and then just endlessly dash into the monster. Be warned, your sharpness will suffer. In a similar vein of kind of impractical, but very fun in a dumb way, Shield Tackle spam. It's not going to get you fast clear times, but maximizing your ability to stun monsters with the Slugger skill, and then throwing in a sprinkling of Stamina Thief as well, just to maximize the value that you get out of Shield Tackle, and then, whatever, enough guard to prevent you from being knocked back while using it, is going to get some really wacky hunts. And in theory, it's actually kind of viable as a strategy against afflicted monsters because of the way Stamina Thief and stamina drain / KO damage interacts with the afflicted state. The next set, however, somehow manages to be even more impractical than the last set. We were finally given a new Rampage decoration in Title Update 2, and Hopefully we'll get some more in the upcoming ones, fingers crossed at least, because unfortunately the one that we did get, Bloody Heart, is powerful on paper, but not really. I've been trying to figure out how to make it work nicely, and the ultimate issue is that the damage buff that the skill gives you only lasts while you've got Blood Blight. And once the Blight is ended, the damage skill is lost, and it's also reset. So the next time you get Blood Blight, even if that happens immediately, you still have to ramp the damage skill all the way back up. What this means is to get use out of Bloody Heart, you have to get hit a lot. And that isn't really something that you want to be doing, but we're going to do it anyway. So we're going to pair Bloody Heart with Counter-Strike to make a true opposite of the Immortal Unkillable armor set. We'll call this Screw My Shield, I'd Rather Be Back at Camp. We're going to go and aim just to get hit a lot to activate Blood Blight. So obviously it's only going to work against afflicted monsters. But it does make Counter-Strike a very solid choice, probably for the first time ever. And I would suggest adding Resentment, except Bloody Heart, or rather Blood Blight, counteracts that because you're now healing health, and that removes your red health, removing the Resentment buff. To really put Bloody Heart into perspective, once it's fully ramped up, you get a plus 30 raw, which is nice. But mathematically speaking, the plus 25 damage from Resentment that you get constantly is going to be better than ramping up to plus 30. So the Bloody Heart meme is technically better without Bloody Heart. The issue, of course, is that you still get Blood Blight while fighting afflicted monsters, and that removes Resentment's uptime rapidly, unless, of course, you're using something like Dereliction that is going to constantly drain your health. So Bloody Heart does get to stay, and because this armor set revolves around us just taking loads and loads of hits, being really beaten up by the monster, we do want to mitigate the amount of damage that they deal to us. The strongest skills defensively is its own can of worms, and a topic far larger than this video about wacky lance sets. Off the cuff, I prefer skills that help me recover health quickly, because getting hit once doesn't normally kill you, so being able to efficiently recover back to full health keeps you safe. But boosting defense can also work pretty well. Skills like Divine Blessing, and I guess Defense Boost, but there are some threshold breakpoint issues with Defense Boost that we don't really have enough time to cover here. Either way, it's a silly meme build. Use it to triple cart in your friends' quests to annoy them. And with that, I think we've finally reached the very bottom of the barrel. And that means that this video is over. I hope you had fun, and that there are some sets in here that give you inspiration. If you did enjoy the video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, as it really helps me and the channel grow. And if this is your first time watching me, I've got plenty of other interesting videos about the Lance if you want to check them out. And if you've watched all of them and you want to see more, then I suggest subscribing. I've got loads of stuff in the pipeline, so stick around if it's what you're after. And finally, after all that, I'd like to thank you for watching. See you next time.